Welcome to Dusk and Empires. Tonight, we uncover the forgotten truth behind William Penn's so-called City of Brotherly Love, a radical utopian dream built on Quaker ideals, backroom land deals, and promises made to people who had no say in keeping them. If this sounds like your kind of bedtime story, subscribe before you drift off. Now get comfortable, close your eyes, and let history carry you to sleep. Opening meditation. Close your eyes, if you haven't already. Let your body settle into whatever surface is holding you right now, the soft give of a mattress, the weight of a blanket pulled close. Take one slow breath in. And let it go. Somewhere across the dark curve of the Atlantic, there is a river. White and silver gray in the early morning light, sliding quietly between forested banks where herons stand motionless in the shallows. It is the Delaware River, and it has been carrying stories for a very long time. Tonight, we are going back gently, slowly, to a moment in the late 17th century, when one man crossed that ocean carrying a dream so unusual, so stubbornly kind, that history has never quite known what to do with it. His name was William Penn. And what he wanted to build was a city of peace. Part 1: A young man in a world on fire. There is an image that stays with you, if you read the letters of William Penn's early life. A young man, barely 22 years old, standing in a courtroom in London in the year 1670, refusing to remove his hat before the judge. Not out of arrogance. Not out of theatrics. But because he believed, with a quiet, unshakable certainty, that no human being owed that kind of deference to another. The judge ordered him to prison. Penn went. And he wrote, from his cell, some of the most eloquent words about religious freedom that the 17th century would ever produce. But to understand why William Penn ended up on a forested riverbank in the New World, building something that had never quite existed before, we need to go back further still. Back to the world that made him. William Penn was born on the 14th of October, 1644, in a London that was already beginning to come apart at the seams. England in the mid-17th century was a place of extraordinary violence and uncertainty, a country that had watched its king go to the scaffold, that had lived through civil war, that was grappling with questions about religion, power, and the rights of ordinary people in ways that no previous generation had been forced to confront quite so directly. His father, Admiral Sir William Penn, was a naval hero, a man of considerable wealth and social standing, close to the corridors of power. The elder Penn had served the Commonwealth under Cromwell and then, with admirable political flexibility, had shifted his allegiances when Charles II was restored to the throne in 1660. He was, by almost every measure, a man of the establishment. A man who understood how the world worked and had made his peace with it. His son would not make that peace quite so easily. Young William was sent to Oxford, to Christ Church College, where the expectation was that he would absorb the proper Anglican religion and the proper social attitudes of a gentleman's son and emerge ready to take his place in the world his father had built for him. But something happened at Oxford that changed everything. He encountered a preacher named Thomas Lowe, a member of the Religious Society of Friends, the Quakers, as they were mockingly called by their opponents, because they were said to quake and tremble in the presence of God. The Quakers believed something radical and beautiful and, to the authorities of the day, profoundly threatening. They believed that every human being had direct access to the divine, what they called the inner light, without the need for priests, or sacraments, or elaborate church hierarchies. They refused to swear oaths, because they believed all speech should be equally truthful. They refused to remove their hats before social superiors, because they believed all people were equal before God. They refused to pay tithes to a church they did not belong to. For these quiet, determined refusals, they were imprisoned, beaten, transported, and executed in considerable numbers throughout the mid-17th century. For a time, it seemed to work. Penn came back from France looking and sounding like a proper young gentleman. He studied law at Lincoln's Inn. He managed his father's Irish estates. He dressed well. He knew how to move through polite society. But then, in 1667, he was in Cork, Ireland, on business, and he heard Thomas Lowe preach again. And this time, the conversion was complete and final. William Penn, 22 years old, heir to one of the most prominent naval families in England, became a Quaker. His father was appalled. He pleaded, threatened, and eventually, in a scene that must have been quietly heartbreaking on both sides, turned his son out of the house. Penn moved among the Quaker communities of England, preaching, writing, going to prison when the authorities demanded it, which they did, repeatedly. He wrote pamphlets with names like The Sandy Foundation Shaken and No Cross, No Crown, works of genuine theological and philosophical sophistication, written in prison cells, arguing for religious toleration, for the rights of conscience, for the idea that a government had no business policing what its citizens believed. These were not safe things to write. And yet Penn wrote them with a steadiness that never quite tipped over into recklessness. He was making an argument, carefully and persistently, for a different kind of world. And slowly, something in his father softened. The old admiral, watching his strange, principled, infuriating son refuse to bend, seemed to realize, perhaps with a kind of reluctant pride, that the boy had something he himself had never quite had. A genuine conviction. Something that couldn't be bought off or frightened away. When Sir William Penn died in 1670, he left his son not just an inheritance, but a connection. A debt owed by the crown. The king owed the Penn family a significant sum, some accounts put it at £16,000, for services rendered during the naval wars. It was this debt, combined with Penn's own growing vision of a place where conscience could breathe freely, that would eventually produce the colony of Pennsylvania. But that was still more than a decade away. And in the meantime, the world that Penn moved through, the London of the 1670s, still reeking of the Great Fire, still haunted by plague, still crackling with religious tension, was about to get considerably more complicated. Penn's time in prison, his appearances before judges, his pamphlets and letters and sermons, all of it was shaping him. Teaching him what he believed, and more importantly, teaching him what kind of place he wanted to exist in the world. A place where the things that had happened to him, and to the thousands of Quakers who had suffered imprisonment, transportation, and death for their beliefs, simply could not happen. He began to think about America. The Quakers had already tried settlement in the New World. There were friends in New Jersey, in the scattered settlements along the Atlantic coast. There were communities of Quakers who had crossed the ocean carrying their testimonies of simplicity and peace into new landscapes. But what Penn was beginning to imagine was something larger, not just a refuge, but a demonstration. A proof, built in wood and stone and city streets, that human beings could live together without coercion. He would spend the next decade moving toward that vision. Through marriage, he wed Gulielma Maria Springett in 1672, a woman of quiet intelligence and deep faith who would be his companion and correspondent through the years of planning and founding. Through politics, where he worked alongside other Quakers and nonconformists to push for legal toleration. And through prayer and reading and the long, slow shaping of an idea into something that could actually be built. The dream of a peaceable city was forming. It would take a king's charter, an ocean crossing, negotiations with people who had lived on that land for thousands of years, and an extraordinary act of civic imagination to bring it into being. But William Penn, stubborn, principled, visionary William Penn, was already beginning to see it clearly. Part 2: The Quakers and the Price of Conscience. There is a quietness to the Quaker meeting house that you feel before you understand it. A stillness that isn't empty, it's expectant. Waiting. The benches are plain wood. The walls are bare. There is no altar, no stained glass, no music. Only people, sitting together in silence, waiting for the inner light to move someone to speak. To the 17th century Church of England, this was not just strange. It was dangerous. The Quakers had emerged in England in the 1650s, during the turbulent years of Cromwell's interregnum, when all the old certainties of church and state seemed to be dissolving and new religious movements were springing up everywhere. George Fox, their founder, had experienced a profound spiritual awakening in 1647, a direct encounter with what he called the light of Christ within, and had spent the following decades preaching this experience across England, gathering followers in the thousands. Fox was charismatic, physically powerful, and utterly uncowed by authority. He was imprisoned 8 times, and each time he emerged more convinced than ever. But it was the community that grew around his teaching that was, in some ways, even more remarkable than the man himself. The Quakers, or Friends, as they called themselves, developed a set of testimonies, lived principles that shaped every aspect of their lives. Simplicity, they dressed plainly, spoke plainly, refused the elaborate courtesies and formalities that marked social hierarchy. Equality, they used thee and thou to address everyone, high and low alike, in an age when these familiar pronouns were reserved for social inferiors, servants, and children. Peace, they refused to bear arms, to participate in war, to use violence for any purpose. Truth, they refused to swear oaths, because to swear implied that ordinary speech might be less than truthful. Each of these testimonies was a small, daily act of resistance against the way the world was organized. And taken together, they added up to something that the authorities found deeply threatening. In 1661, the Quaker Act was passed, making it illegal for Friends to refuse to take oaths or to meet in groups of more than 5 people for unauthorized worship. The penalties were severe fines, imprisonment, transportation. And the Quakers, for the most part, simply continued to meet, continued to refuse, and were imprisoned in considerable numbers. By some estimates, over 15,000 Quakers were imprisoned in England between 1660 and 1685. More than 400 died in prison. They were held in terrible conditions, cold, damp cells, overcrowded and underfed, and they endured it with a kind of dignified steadiness that both frustrated their captors and moved many observers. William Penn saw this suffering firsthand. He experienced it himself, in the Tower of London and in Newgate Prison. And it deepened in him a conviction that was already profound, that no government had the right to tell a person what to believe, or how to worship, or whether to doff a hat in acknowledgement of another man's superior social standing. But Penn was unusual among Quakers in one crucial respect. He had access to power. Through his father's connections, through his own considerable intelligence and legal training, through the social networks he had cultivated before his conversion, Penn could walk into rooms that other Quakers could not enter. He could speak with members of Parliament, with lawyers and judges, and eventually, with the king himself. Charles II, who had restored the English monarchy in 1660, was in some ways a surprising ally for a Quaker. He was hedonistic, politically calculating, and genuinely fond of religious tolerance, partly because it suited his own complicated religious situation as a secret Catholic, and partly because he had a genuine distaste for persecution. He and Penn had an odd, unlikely relationship, the dissolute king and the principled Quaker, but there was a mutual respect there that Penn would eventually put to remarkable use. In the 1670s, Penn became increasingly involved in Quaker settlement in the New World. He helped negotiate the terms of the West Jersey settlement, contributing to a document called the Concessions and Agreements of West New Jersey, written in 1677, which was a genuinely remarkable piece of political thought. It guaranteed freedom of conscience, trial by jury, freedom from arbitrary imprisonment, and the right of all settlers, regardless of religion, to participate in government. These were not just abstract principles. They were written in response to the specific sufferings of the Quaker community, the arbitrary imprisonments, the denial of legal rights, the religious persecution. Penn and his collaborators were designing, on paper, the opposite of what they had experienced. And the West Jersey experiment showed Penn something important, that it was possible to govern a community on different principles. That the familiar English arrangements of established church, social hierarchy, and coerced conformity were not, in fact, the only way to organize human society. He began to think bigger. Much bigger. The Quaker community in England was still suffering. Despite all the legal arguments, all the pamphlets, all the patient, dignified resistance, the persecution continued. And Penn began to think that what the Friends needed was not just legal reform in England, though he continued to work for that, but a place. A physical place. A city and a province where the principles he believed in could be demonstrated in practice. Not just for Quakers. For everyone. This was what made Penn's vision unusual even among his own community. He was not thinking of a Quaker colony, a religious enclave, protected and exclusive. He was thinking of an open city. A city that would welcome people of different faiths and backgrounds, that would demonstrate that human beings did not need a coercive state religion to live together in peace and order. He called it, in his early writings, a holy experiment. The phrase is careful and a little tentative, an experiment, not a certainty. Penn was too honest to claim that he knew it would work. But he believed, with the deep, quiet conviction that characterized everything he did, that it was worth trying. And now, with his father's debt to the crown, he had the means to try it. Part 3, The Charter and the Dream. Picture a room in Whitehall in the late winter of 1681. Stone floors and dark wood paneling. Candles guttering in the draught from a window that never quite closes properly. The smell of tallow and wood smoke and the faint, persistent damp of a building that has stood too long beside the Thames. In this room, or one very like it, a document was signed that would change the map of the world. On the 4th of March, 1681, King Charles II granted William Penn a charter for a province in the New World, a vast territory of some 45,000 square miles between the 40th and 43rd parallels, west of the Delaware River. The king named it Pennsylvania, Penn's Woods, ostensibly in honor of Penn's father, the admiral, though Penn himself was mortified by the name, worrying that it would look like vanity. He wrote to the king's secretary asking if it might be called New Wales, or Sylvania. Charles was amused but unmoved. Pennsylvania it was, and Pennsylvania it has remained. The charter was a remarkable document in several ways. It gave Penn and his heirs virtually absolute authority over the province. He was, in legal terms, a proprietor, holding his land from the king in something like a feudal relationship. But Penn had no intention of governing like a feudal lord. Even as the ink was drying on the charter, he was already drafting the frame of government that would actually shape how Pennsylvania was to be run. He wrote the first draft himself, in a white heat of idealism, and then submitted it to a committee of friends and other trusted advisors for revision. The process was slow and sometimes contentious. Penn wanted to give the people of his colony as much self-government as possible. His advisors worried that he was giving away too much, that the thing would collapse into disorder without sufficient authority at the center. The tension in those discussions is fascinating, because it is a tension that democratic societies are still working through today. How much freedom is too much? How much order is too little? Penn's instinct was always toward freedom. His advisors kept pulling him back toward practicality. And the document they eventually produced, the Frame of Government of 1682, was a compromise, but a remarkable one. It established an elected assembly, a council, a governor, Penn himself, to begin with, and a set of fundamental rights that included freedom of conscience, trial by jury, and the right to know the charges against you before you could be imprisoned. It was not a perfect document by any modern standard. It did not, for instance, abolish slavery, a failure that would haunt the colony's history. But by the standards of the 17th century, it was extraordinary. And alongside the frame of government, Penn was drafting something else, something that in some ways reveals his character even more clearly. He was writing a letter to the people who already lived in the land he had just been granted. The indigenous peoples of the Delaware Valley, the Lenape, whom the colonists often called the Delaware, had been living in that landscape for thousands of years. They knew the river, the forests, the seasons, the particular quality of the light on autumn afternoons when the leaves turned and the air turned sharp. They had their own governments, their own spiritual practices, their own complex social structures. Penn was aware of this. And his response to it was, by the standards of the 17th century, unusual to the point of being almost unprecedented. He wrote to the Lenape leaders before he even arrived in the colony. In a letter of 1681, he expressed his intention to deal with them honestly, to purchase the land he needed rather than simply taking it, and to treat them as equals. The letter is careful and sincere. Penn wrote that he desired to enjoy it with your love and consent, that we may always live together as neighbors and friends. He acknowledged that the land belonged to the people who lived on it. He promised fair prices. He promised that any disputes between settlers and Lenape would be judged by a jury of equal numbers of both peoples. Whether Penn fully understood the gap between his good intentions and the structural realities of colonial expansion is a question worth sitting with quietly. He was still, after all, operating within a colonial system, claiming land under a king's charter, bringing settlers who would inevitably transform the landscape. But his intentions were real, and his early dealings with the Lenape were genuinely different from most of what European colonization looked like in this period. Back in England, meanwhile, Penn was doing something else equally important. He was advertising. He wrote a promotional pamphlet called Some Account of the Province of Pennsylvania, describing the land, the climate, the opportunities available to settlers. He had it translated into German, Dutch, and French. He sent copies to Quaker meetings across England, Wales, Ireland, and the continent. He corresponded with German Pietist communities, with French Huguenots, with Dutch Mennonites, all the dissenting, persecuted, religiously unorthodox communities of Europe who might be looking for a place to breathe. Penn was not just building a colony. He was curating a community. He was deliberately trying to attract people of different backgrounds, different languages, different religious traditions, to come together in one place and demonstrate that diversity was not a threat but a strength. By the time Penn himself crossed the Atlantic, in the autumn of 1682, thousands of people were already making plans to follow him. The dream was in motion. But the reality, the muddy, complicated, gloriously imperfect reality, was just beginning. Part 4: The Crossing. It is late August, 1682. The ship is called the Welcome, and she is a 100-ton vessel, not large by the standards of Atlantic trade, riding low in the water under the weight of her passengers, about 100 Quaker settlers, most of them from England and Wales. The smell below decks is already oppressive before they have cleared the Thames. Salt water and bilge and human bodies packed close together, the creak of wood under the constant gentle pressure of the river current. Above, the sky is the pale, washed-out blue of late summer, and the wind that fills the sails carries the smell of the sea, that indefinable combination of salt and distance and possibility. William Penn stood at the rail as the English coastline receded. He was 37 years old. He was leaving behind his wife Gulielma, who was too unwell to make the crossing, his young children, his comfortable life among the English Quaker community. He was sailing towards something he had spent years imagining but had never seen. The crossing took just over 2 months. It was not an easy passage. Smallpox broke out among the passengers somewhere in the middle of the Atlantic. By the time the Welcome dropped anchor in the Delaware River in late October, 31 of her passengers were dead. Penn himself apparently helped nurse the sick, sitting with the dying, organizing the care of those who could still be helped. It was, by all accounts, an awful crossing. And it tested the community even before they had set foot in their new home. There is something quietly poignant about this. Penn had spent years imagining the holy experiment, the peaceable city, the just government, the place where conscience was free. And the very first act of his colony's history was an epidemic, a series of deaths, a reminder that no amount of visionary idealism could fully prepare you for the world's stubborn insistence on complication. When the Welcome finally reached Newcastle, in what is now Delaware, on the 27th of October, 1682, Penn received a formal welcome from the existing settlers of the region. There were already Dutch, Swedish, and English communities along the Delaware, people who had been there for decades before Penn's charter. Penn's first official act on American soil was to receive the symbolic keys to the fort at Newcastle, transferring the authority of the territory from the Duke of York, the future James II, to Penn himself. It was a ceremony, yes, but Penn seems to have felt the weight of it genuinely. He was, for the first time, standing in the actual landscape that he had dreamed about from across the ocean. He walked out onto the land and turned it in his hands. He knelt and picked up a clod of earth, this is recorded in contemporary accounts, and held it for a moment. The gesture seems almost too symbolic to be true, but it has the ring of something a man like Penn might actually do. Grounding himself. Feeling the reality of the place beneath his hands. From Newcastle, Penn traveled up the Delaware River by boat, stopping at various settlements along the way, meeting people, seeing the landscape for the first time. The river was extraordinary. White and silver, flanked by forests of oak and elm and chestnut and maple, their autumn colors burning in the late October light. Deer moved through the underbrush at the water's edge. Herons watched from the shallows with their characteristic patient stillness. The air had the particular cold clarity of a North American autumn, sharper than anything Penn had experienced in England, cleaner, almost shimmering. And somewhere along that river, Penn had his first meetings with Lenape leaders. The accounts of these early encounters are fragmentary, filtered through layers of colonial record-keeping that often failed to capture the Lenape perspective with any accuracy. But what seems clear is that Penn made a genuine effort to meet on something approaching equal terms, to listen, to negotiate, to exchange gifts and the protocols of Lenape diplomacy, to make his intentions clear. He spoke through interpreters, and the limitations of that, the inevitable losses of meaning, nuance, cultural context, must have been frustrating for everyone involved. But the meetings happened. And they were, by the measures available to us, conducted with more good faith on both sides than almost any other comparable encounter in the history of North American colonization. By the time Penn reached the site he had chosen for his city, the neck of land between the Delaware River to the east and the Schuylkill River to the west, he had been in America for only a few weeks. But he already understood, in the bones, something important, that the land was real, the people on it were real, and the dream of a peaceable city was going to require a great deal of very practical, very unglamorous work to become anything more than a dream. Part 5, The Grid and the Green Country Town. Thomas Holme was a quiet man. A surveyor by training, a Quaker by conviction, and a man of considerable practical intelligence, exactly the kind of person you need when you are trying to translate a vision into a street plan. Penn had appointed Holme as Surveyor General of Pennsylvania, and it was Holme who actually walked the land between the Delaware and the Schuylkill, measuring and marking, figuring out how to impose human order on a landscape of forest, marsh, and creek. The plan that Holme produced, in close consultation with Penn, who sent detailed instructions from England before he even arrived, was remarkable. It was a grid. A clean, rational, generous grid of streets running east to west and north to south, with the city organized around two main thoroughfares, High Street, which we now call Market Street, running from river to river, and Broad Street, running north to south through the center of the plan. At the center of the grid, where Broad and High Streets crossed, Holme placed a public square, a large, open space for the civic life of the city. And at each of the four corners of the city's plan, he placed additional open squares, 4 of them, each of approximately 8 acres, intended as parks, as green spaces, as places where the citizens of the city might breathe and rest and let their children play. These 5 squares survive today. Center Square became the site of City Hall. The 4 corner squares are still there, still carrying the names Penn gave them: Logan Square, Rittenhouse Square, Washington Square, and Franklin Square. They are the lungs of the city, the places where the grid pauses and opens, where the relentless logic of commerce and movement makes room for something gentler. Penn's instructions to Holme were explicit and revealing. He wanted a great town, or city, in the most convenient place upon the river. He wanted it to be a place where every house had enough land around it for gardens or orchards or fields. He called it a green country town, which will never be burnt, and always be wholesome. The phrase, "never be burnt," is not accidental. Penn had grown up in the shadow of the Great Fire of London in 1666, which had consumed more than 13,000 houses and left tens of thousands of people homeless in the space of 4 days. The terrible fires of 17th-century cities, packed tight with wooden structures, were a constant threat to urban life. Penn wanted his city to be different, spacious, with houses set back from the street, with green space between buildings, with room for air and light and for fire, if it came, to be contained. The grid itself was not Penn's invention. Grids had been used to plan colonial towns before, but the particular generosity of this grid, its scale, its provision of public green space, its commitment to spreading the city's population across a wide landscape rather than packing it into a dense, airless core, was unusual. Penn also made decisions about property that were, by the standards of the day, remarkably egalitarian. He offered land in the city to settlers on what he called a free society of traders plan. Essentially, investors in the colony would receive a proportional share of both country land and city lots. He wanted the city's prosperity to be shared broadly, not concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy proprietors. Whether this worked out in practice as Penn intended is a complicated story, one that involves a great deal of legal and financial maneuvering over the following decades. But the intention was clear, and it was rooted in Penn's Quaker conviction that the goods of the earth belonged, in some fundamental sense, to all the people who lived on it. He drew on the thought of Gerard Winstanley and the Diggers, the radical agrarian movement that had briefly flourished during the interregnum, and on the ideas of the Levelers, and on his own theological conviction that hierarchy and coercion were not the natural order of things but human distortions of it. The city that Home was laying out on the ground, with his surveyor's chains and his stakes and his careful measurements, was the physical expression of all of this. It was an argument in wood and stone and planned green space. An argument that said, human beings, when you give them enough room and enough freedom, will build something beautiful. The first settlers began arriving in the winter and spring of 1682 and 1683. They came from England and Wales, from Ireland and Scotland, from Germany and the Netherlands. They came speaking different languages, carrying different religious traditions, different habits of mind and hand and cookery. They found a landscape that was, in many ways, extraordinary. The Delaware Valley in the early 1680s was a place of dense, largely undisturbed forest, vast stands of white oak and tulip poplar, chestnut, and hickory, the air thick in summer with the sound of birds, the undergrowth full of deer and turkey and the tracks of animals that the settlers would have never seen in England. The winters were harder than anything most of them had experienced. The summers were hotter and more humid. The spring flooding of the Delaware could be sudden and savage. The land was rich, extraordinarily rich, in ways that European soil, exhausted by centuries of cultivation, often was not. The first settlers built what they could, where they could. Some of them, arriving in the autumn of 1682, found that their city lots had not yet been surveyed, their houses not yet built. They sheltered in caves dug into the banks of the Delaware River, not an image that fits the vision of the holy experiment, but a very real piece of Philadelphia's founding story. There is something both humbling and endearing about the image of the first Philadelphians, huddled in riverbank caves in the winter of 1682, waiting for their holy experiment to get properly underway. It is a reminder that even the most beautiful visions have to be built by cold, tired, uncertain human hands. Part 6: The Great Treaty and the Lenape. There is a painting that has hung in reproductions across the walls of American history classrooms for more than 2 centuries. It shows William Penn, in his broad Quaker hat and plain gray coat, standing under a great elm tree on the banks of the Delaware. Before him, a group of Lenape men and women are gathered, some seated, some standing. Gifts are being exchanged. Hands are extended in gestures of good faith. The painting was done by Benjamin West in 1771, nearly a century after the event it depicts, and it has the soft, idealized quality of all retrospective history paintings. But underneath the idealization, there is a real event, the treaty made between William Penn and the Lenape chiefs in the early months of 1683, at a place called Shakamaxon, which is now the Kensington neighborhood of Philadelphia. The Lenape had been living in the Delaware Valley for thousands of years. They called the river the Lenapwehitic, the river of the Lenape, and they had an intimate, practical, spiritual relationship with its landscape. They were farmers who grew corn, beans, and squash in the river bottoms. They were hunters who knew the forests in every season. They were diplomats, politicians, traders, storytellers, a complex civilization with its own internal diversity, its own regional variations, its own history of conflict and alliance with neighboring peoples. The arrival of European settlers had already changed their world profoundly before Penn arrived. The Dutch and the Swedes had been trading with the Lenape since the early 17th century. Diseases carried by European traders, smallpox, measles, influenza, had swept through Lenape communities with devastating effect, killing, by some estimates, half or more of the population in some areas before Penn's colony was even imagined. The Lenape knew what European settlement looked like. They had watched the Dutch drive the Swedes out. They had watched the English drive the Dutch out. They understood, with the hard-won clarity of experience, that each wave of settlement brought pressure on their land, their hunting grounds, their freedom of movement. So when Penn's representatives arrived with offers of purchase and promises of friendship, the Lenape chiefs had every reason to be cautious. And yet the treaty at Chacamaxon seems to have been conducted with genuine good faith on both sides. The details of exactly what was said and agreed are difficult to reconstruct. No written record from the Lenape side survives, and the English accounts are incomplete. But what we know is this: Penn purchased land along the Delaware and its tributaries through a series of deeds, negotiated rather than simply seized. He paid prices that the Lenape considered fair. He established protocols for resolving disputes. He promised that settlers would not hunt on Lenape lands or damage Lenape property without compensation. The Lenape chief Tamanend Tammany, in the anglicized form that would later become famous, was among those who negotiated with Penn. He seems to have been a man of considerable political skill and genuine goodwill, someone who saw in Penn's offer something that might actually work, a coexistence rather than a conquest. The philosopher Voltaire, writing in France decades later, called the Treaty of Chacamaxon the only treaty between those people and the Christians that was never sworn to and never broken. Voltaire was being polemical, and the history of Penn's dealings with the Lenape is more complicated than his praise suggests. But the core of his observation was true. Penn's early treaties held, in ways that almost no other agreements between European colonists and indigenous peoples in this period did. Penn made a genuine effort to learn the Lenape language. He spent time studying it, corresponding with Lenape speakers, trying to understand the culture he was entering as a neighbor rather than a conqueror. His letters from this period show a man genuinely curious about and respectful of Lenape life, their agriculture, their governance, their ways of settling disputes. He wrote admiringly of Lenape political structures, the way decisions were made by consensus, the role of women in governance, the care with which Lenape communities deliberated before committing to a course of action. In some of his descriptions of Lenape governance, you can see the influence of what he was observing on his own political thinking. But Penn was also, inescapably, a colonial proprietor. He was bringing settlers who needed land. And even the most careful, most respectful purchase agreement is still a transaction that fundamentally alters the relationship between a people and their homeland. Penn's land purchases, made in good faith and with genuine respect, still meant that Lenape people were selling rights to land they had used and understood in ways that the English legal concept of property did not quite capture. For the Lenape, selling the right to settle on land was not the same thing as surrendering all their own rights to move through it, hunt on it, fish in its rivers. The English concept of exclusive property ownership was not easily mapped onto Lenape understandings of land. These misunderstandings, even when entered into in good faith, would have consequences. Not immediately, not during Penn's lifetime, but later, in the years after his death, when his heirs would be less scrupulous, less patient, less genuinely curious about the people they were dealing with. But in the 1680s, the relationship held. And what Penn achieved, genuine, sustained coexistence with indigenous neighbors, based on negotiation and purchase rather than violence, was rare enough in colonial history to deserve to be remembered with both admiration and complexity. The Lenape called Penn Onas, a rendering of his name in their own language, meaning quill or feather, the instrument of writing. The name became a kind of title, used to address the governors of Pennsylvania long after Penn himself was gone. It was a mark of the relationship he had built, imperfect, asymmetric, but real. Part 7. The city takes shape. By the spring of 1683, Philadelphia was beginning to look like something. Not yet the city it would become, that would take decades, and generations of hands, and the slow accretion of commerce and culture and civic life. But the outlines of something recognizable were emerging from the mud and the stumps and the cleared land between the rivers. Streets were being laid out along Holmes' grid. Houses were being built, some of wood, some of the local red brick that would come to define the city's architectural character, warm and mellow in the afternoon sun, glowing almost amber in the last light of winter afternoons. Shops were opening. A market was being established on High Street, where farmers from the surrounding countryside could bring their produce and settlers could buy what they needed. The population was growing with remarkable speed. By 1683, there were already more than 2,000 settlers in the Philadelphia area. By 1685, the number had climbed toward 8,000. People were arriving from across England and Wales, Quaker families who had saved and planned for years for this opportunity. From the Rhineland and Germany, groups of Mennonites and German Reformed Christians who had suffered their own forms of religious persecution. From the Netherlands, from Ireland, from Scotland. Each group brought something different. The Welsh settlers established communities in what is now the mainline suburbs. They had asked Penn for a Welsh tract, a contiguous area of land where they could preserve their language and culture, and Penn had granted it. The German settlers, the first of whom, a group of 13 families from Krefeld, arrived in 1683, established Germantown, just north of the city, which would become one of the most culturally distinctive communities in colonial America. The leader of the Germantown settlers was a man named Francis Daniel Pastorius, a German lawyer and scholar of formidable erudition who had been drawn to Penn's vision of the holy experiment. Pastorius was, in many ways, the ideal immigrant for Penn's colony, learned, tolerant, deeply principled, genuinely committed to the idea that people of different backgrounds could live together in harmony. He wrote voluminously about his experience in Pennsylvania. His letters and diaries are among the most vivid records we have of what it felt like to be in that place in those early years. He describes the landscape with a mixture of wonder and practical concern, the extraordinary fertility of the soil, the abundance of wildlife, the challenging reality of clearing forest and building homes. He describes the Lenape with curiosity and respect, recording their practices and customs with the careful attention of someone who understood that he was in someone else's home. And he describes the city itself, the raw, unfinished, exciting reality of a place being built by many hands for the first time. Philadelphia in 1683 had a smell that no amount of idealism could entirely overcome, the smell of new lumber and turned earth, of wood smoke and river mud, of animals kept close to houses in the English rural tradition, of the peculiar organic sweetness that comes with a large human community establishing itself in a previously uncultivated landscape. It also had a sound. The sound of hammers and saws, of wagon wheels on unpaved streets, of the Delaware River against its banks, of geese in the marshes south of town, of the particular low murmur of a diverse community learning to speak to each other across barriers of language and custom. Penn himself was everywhere in these early months, meeting with settlers, negotiating land disputes, holding court, conducting religious meetings, writing letters by candlelight late into the night. He was a proprietor, a governor, a religious leader, a neighbor, a diplomat. The demands on him were extraordinary. He built himself a modest house, not the grand manor house that his social position might have suggested, but a plain, well-built structure at Pennsbury, upstream from the city on the Delaware. He designed the gardens himself, laid out in the formal English style he knew from his childhood, with fruit trees and kitchen gardens and paths between beds of flowers. There is something touching about the Pennsbury Gardens. Penn had crossed the Atlantic to build a new kind of society, a city organized on principles of equality and freedom. And then, in his own garden, he planted the flowers of his homeland, lavender and rosemary and old English roses, as if the body could not entirely leave behind what the spirit had chosen to transcend. He wrote to Gulielma often. Long letters, full of the details of what he was building, the challenges he was facing, the beauty of the landscape that she had not been well enough to see. The letters have a quality of longing in them, not just for his wife, but for something that he was trying to put into words. A feeling that what was happening here, in this muddy, beautiful, complicated place, actually mattered. In 1683, Penn wrote a letter to the Free Society of Traders describing Pennsylvania that has become one of the foundational documents of American history. In it, he describes the landscape, the climate, the people, the government. He describes the Lenape with that mixture of admiration and condescension that characterizes even the most well-intentioned colonial observers of this period. And he describes his city, the city he is building, with a clarity and confidence that is almost heartbreaking in its certainty that things will work out. They would. And they wouldn't. But in 1683, in the early spring of a new world, it was possible to believe that the holy experiment was working. Part 8: The Frame of Government and the Laws. There is a line in the preface to Penn's Frame of Government of 1682 that stops you when you read it. Governments, like clocks, go from the motion men give them, he wrote. And as governments are made and moved by men, so by them they are ruined, too. Wherefore governments rather depend upon men, than men upon governments. This is not the usual language of 17th century political writing. Most political theorists of Penn's era were concerned with establishing the right structure of government, the correct balance of powers, the proper relationship between king and parliament, the divine sanction of authority. Penn was saying something subtler and more demanding, that the quality of government ultimately depends on the quality of the people doing the governing, and that the quality of the people doing the governing depends on whether they have been formed, by education and experience and culture, into people of good character. This conviction shaped everything about the Pennsylvania Legal Code, which Penn and his assembly worked out in their first sessions in December of 1682 and into 1683. The Great Law of Pennsylvania, as it came to be called, was a remarkable document. It established freedom of conscience, the right of every settler to worship according to their own beliefs, as the foundation of the colony's legal order. It reduced the number of capital crimes from the hundreds that existed in English law to just 2, treason and murder. In England at this time, you could be hanged for picking a pocket. You could be executed for stealing a horse, for cutting down a tree in the wrong forest, for dozens of offenses that had nothing to do with violence or genuine harm to another person. Penn's law said, no. The state does not have the right to take a life except in response to the taking of a life. The law also provided for rehabilitation, a word that would not have been used in the 17th century, but the concept was there. Prisons in Pennsylvania were to be workhouses where people could learn trades, not dungeons where they simply waited to suffer. Education was mandated. Every child was to be taught to read and write and be instructed in some useful trade or skill. Penn believed that ignorance was one of the great engines of social misery, and that a government had a responsibility to ensure that its citizens had the tools they needed to participate in their own governance. This belief in education was not just instrumental, not just about producing useful workers, but was rooted in Penn's Quaker theology. If every person had access to the inner light, the direct experience of the divine, then every person needed to be able to read the scriptures and the laws by which they were governed. Literacy was a spiritual as well as a civic necessity. The assembly that governed Pennsylvania in its early years was not a perfect democratic body by any modern standard. Penn himself retained significant authority as proprietor, and he sometimes exercised it in ways that frustrated his colonists. Women could not vote. Enslaved people, and there were enslaved people in Pennsylvania from almost the very beginning, a painful shadow on the holy experiment, had no legal standing at all. The Quakers' own complex relationship with slavery is one of the most difficult aspects of Pennsylvania's founding to sit with. The colony was, from the beginning, a place where enslaved Africans were held in bondage, and Penn himself owned enslaved people. His frame of government did not abolish slavery. But something important did happen in Germantown, Pennsylvania, in 1688. Francis Daniel Pastorius, that learned, principled German lawyer, gathered with a small group of fellow Mennonites and drafted a petition to the Quaker meeting. It was the first formal, written protest against slavery in the history of the Americas. It was called the Germantown Quaker Petition Against Slavery, and it asked the Friends, in measured, careful, deeply serious language, how they could hold other human beings in bondage when their own testimonies committed them to equality and the inner light in every person. The petition was signed by just 4 people. And the Quaker meeting, uncomfortable and uncertain, tabled it, set it aside without action. It was not the answer that Pastorius and his colleagues hoped for. But the question they asked would not go away. It would be asked again and again, with increasing urgency, by Quakers in the decades that followed, by Benjamin Lay, the fierce eccentric who protested slavery at Friends meetings in ways that were deeply disruptive and deeply sincere. By John Woolman, the gentle tailor from New Jersey who walked through the South visiting slaveholders and asking them, quietly, to consider what they were doing. By Anthony Benezet, the Huguenot schoolteacher who educated free and enslaved black children in Philadelphia and wrote some of the most important early abolitionist texts in the English language. The seed that Pastorius planted in 1688 would grow, slowly and painfully, into the abolitionist movement that would transform American Quakerism by the mid-18th century and contribute to the larger American anti-slavery cause that eventually, long after Penn's death, long after the holy experiment had evolved into something more complicated than Penn had imagined, produced emancipation. Penn's laws were imperfect. His colony was imperfect. But the principles embedded in those laws, freedom of conscience, the presumption of innocence, the value of education, the rights of the accused, were real, and they had consequences that extended far beyond Penn's lifetime and far beyond the borders of Pennsylvania. Part 9: The Holy Experiment in Practice. What does a holy experiment actually look like on an ordinary Tuesday morning? It looks like High Street in Philadelphia in the spring of 1685. The market is open, and the street is crowded with people speaking at least 3 or 4 different languages: English, Welsh, German, Dutch, and somewhere in the mix the sounds of Lenape conversation, because indigenous traders come to the Philadelphia market, selling furs and corn and pottery. A Quaker merchant in his plain gray coat is examining a bolt of wool from a German weaver who came over from the Palatinate 2 years ago. They are haggling, in a mixture of English and German and gestures, over a price that both of them consider fair. Nearby, a Swedish woman who has been in the Delaware Valley since before Penn arrived, her father came with Johann Prince's expedition in the 1640s, is selling dried herbs from a basket. A young Welshman, newly arrived and still bewildered by the scale of the forest that begins just beyond the city's western edge, is asking directions from a free black man who has been in Philadelphia for 3 years and knows the streets better than anyone. This is not a utopia. There are arguments and grievances, lawsuits and disputes, moments of prejudice and misunderstanding, and simple human friction. But it is something. It is a place where all these different people are, somehow, managing to coexist, not because they have been forced to by a powerful authority, but because the structures Penn has put in place give them a reason to try. Penn's court system in these early years was notably different from English courts in one crucial respect: it was accessible. In England, legal proceedings were expensive, complicated, and conducted entirely in English, a language that many of Pennsylvania's settlers did not speak well. Penn's courts made provisions for interpreters, simplified procedures, and reduced costs. The result was that ordinary people actually used the courts to settle disputes, rather than resorting to violence or simply letting grievances fester. And there was a Jewish community. Small at first, perhaps just a few families, but present and accepted. The first Jewish settlers in Philadelphia arrived in the early 1680s, and they found, for the first time in a European-derived colonial context, a place where their presence was not merely tolerated but legally protected. Penn's promise of freedom of conscience was not just for Christians. His frame of government extended its protections to any person or persons inhabiting in this province, who shall confess and acknowledge one Almighty God. This was a broad enough formulation to include Jews, and it was interpreted that way in practice. The Philadelphia of the 1680s was not a cosmopolitan city in the way that Amsterdam or London were cosmopolitan. It was still a small, raw, frontier settlement. But it had, from the very beginning, a quality of openness, a willingness to let different kinds of people exist alongside each other, that was unusual enough in its time to attract notice from observers across Europe. The French Quaker traveler and writer Gabriel Thomas, who visited Pennsylvania in the 1690s, wrote about Philadelphia with barely contained amazement. He described his city that had grown from nothing to a substantial settlement of several thousand people in just 10 years. He described the market, the courts, the diversity of the population, the quality of the housing. He described a place where, he wrote, Christian, Jew, and Turk could live together in peace, the word Turk being his somewhat imprecise shorthand for Muslim, though there is no evidence of a Muslim population in early Philadelphia. The amazement in Thomas's writing is telling. He was a man of considerable experience, someone who had traveled widely in Europe and the Atlantic world, and he found Philadelphia genuinely surprising. Not because it was large or rich or powerful, it was none of those things yet, but because of what it felt like to be there. It felt, he wrote, like a place where the ordinary rules had been suspended, where the usual hierarchies and exclusions had been set aside, where something new was actually being attempted. Of course, the ordinary rules had not been entirely suspended. Penn was still a proprietor, with considerable authority over the colony. The social hierarchies of English life had been transplanted along with the settlers, even if they were somewhat muted. Indentured servants, people who had sold years of their labor in exchange for passage to the New World, worked long hours under conditions that were sometimes harsh. Enslaved people suffered in ways that the colony's founding principles should have demanded be addressed immediately and were not. But the general direction of things, the trajectory of the holy experiment, was towards something more humane, more inclusive, more genuinely tolerant than almost anything else that was happening in the colonial Atlantic world in the 1680s. And Penn knew it. He felt it, in those early years, as a kind of vindication. The thing he had argued for, the thing he had gone to prison for, was actually working. People of different backgrounds, different faiths, different languages were living together and building something together. It was enough, for the moment. More than enough. Part 10: Trouble in the Peaceable Kingdom. Every experiment encounters friction. And the holy experiment was no exception. The trouble began almost immediately, in the small print of governance, in the arguments about who had what powers, in the friction between Penn's authority as proprietor and the Assembly's desire for self-government, in the disputes about land that are inevitable wherever people are trying to carve a new society out of occupied territory. Penn had promised his colonists an extraordinary degree of self-government. But self-government requires consensus, and consensus requires people to agree on something. And the settlers of Pennsylvania were, almost by design, an extraordinarily diverse and independent-minded group. They had come precisely because they did not fit comfortably into the established orders of Europe. They were not naturally inclined toward deference. The assembly that Penn had established was quarrelsome from the beginning. Members argued about the extent of their own powers. Some wanted the assembly to be able to originate legislation, not just ratify what the council proposed. Some wanted more control over taxation. Some wanted the proprietor's authority to be more clearly limited. Penn was patient with these disputes, mostly. He was, temperamentally, a man who preferred persuasion to coercion, and he spent a great deal of time and energy trying to manage the competing factions of his colony through letters, meetings, and personal appeals. But in 1684, Penn was forced to return to England. The reasons were urgent and multiple. The boundary dispute with Lord Baltimore over the southern boundary of Maryland and Pennsylvania had reached a critical point, and Penn needed to be in London to defend his colony's territorial claims. King Charles II was also seriously ill. He would die in February of 1685, and the political situation in England was becoming extremely complicated. Penn left Pennsylvania in August of 1684 and would not return for 15 years. 15 years is a long time. In 15 years, a city grows and changes and develops habits and interests that its founder cannot fully control. In 15 years, the people who have come to live in Philadelphia develop their own understanding of what the holy experiment means, and their understanding is not always the same as Penn's. The man Penn left in charge of day-to-day governance, his deputy Thomas Lloyd, was a capable and principled Quaker. But the structural problems of the colony, the tension between proprietary authority and popular self-government, the legal and financial tangles of land distribution, the boundary disputes, were difficult to manage from a distance. Penn, meanwhile, was navigating the dangerous shoals of English politics. After Charles II died, his brother James II, a Catholic, took the throne. Penn, who had worked for years with James, then Duke of York, on questions of religious toleration, was closer to the new king than many of his Quaker contemporaries were comfortable with. Penn genuinely believed that James was committed to religious toleration, and he used his access to the king to secure the release of hundreds of Quakers from English prisons. He may have helped draft the Declaration of Indulgence of 1687, which temporarily suspended the penal laws against religious dissenters. But James II's reign ended in disaster, with the Glorious Revolution of 1688, when William of Orange landed in England and James fled to France. Penn's close association with the deposed king made him a suspect figure in the new regime. He was accused of treason. The charges were eventually dismissed, but the process was grinding and humiliating. He was stripped of the governorship of Pennsylvania in 1692, and the colony was placed under the jurisdiction of the royal governor of New York, Benjamin Fletcher. For 2 years, Penn's holy experiment was governed by someone else, someone who had no particular interest in the principles that had shaped it. The Quakers in Pennsylvania did not take this quietly. They insisted on their rights, refused to provide the militia that Fletcher demanded, continued to operate their assembly according to the principles Penn had established. It was a kind of passive, principled resistance, very Quaker, and it worked well enough to preserve the essential character of the colony during the interregnum. Penn was restored to the proprietorship in 1694. But the years of his absence had changed things. The colony had developed in directions he had not fully anticipated. The assembly had grown in confidence and assertiveness. The population had become more diverse and more commercially oriented. And there were financial problems. Penn's finances were in a state of chronic crisis throughout the 1690s. The income from Pennsylvania that he had hoped to receive, the quit rents, the fees from land sales, was far less than expected, because his colonists were reluctant to pay and his agents in the colony were incompetent or dishonest or both. He was, at various points in the 1690s, seriously in debt. He spent time in a debtor's prison in England, an experience that must have added a particular sting of personal humiliation to the man who had advocated so passionately for the reform of England's brutal prison system. Penn's personal life was also marked by grief. Gulielma, his beloved wife, died in 1694 after years of chronic illness. Penn was devastated. He described her in letters as the center of his world, the person who had made everything else bearable. Her loss left a wound that never quite healed. He married again, in 1696, a younger woman named Hannah Callowhill, daughter of a Bristol merchant. Hannah Penn was, as it turned out, a woman of exceptional strength and intelligence. She would eventually run the colony herself, during the years of Penn's incapacitation. But in 1696, she was simply the woman who had agreed to share the complicated, uncertain life of a man who was trying to build a new kind of society across the ocean while managing chronic debt and political persecution at home. In 1699, Penn finally returned to Pennsylvania. He arrived to find a city that he had not quite imagined when he left 15 years before. Philadelphia had grown into a substantial town of several thousand people, with wharves and warehouses along the Delaware, a thriving market, several churches, a growing merchant class, and a political culture that was considerably more combative and self-assured than the one Penn had left behind. It was, in many ways, exactly what the holy experiment was supposed to produce: a community of capable, independent-minded people who knew their rights and were prepared to defend them. The only problem was that they were now just as ready to defend their rights against William Penn as against anyone else. Part 11: The Walking Purchase and the Shadow That Fell. There is a long, slow darkness that falls across the story of Pennsylvania in the years after William Penn's death. It does not fall all at once. It comes gradually, the way light fades on a winter afternoon, so slowly that you almost don't notice until you realize the sky has gone gray. Penn returned to Pennsylvania in 1699, and he had 2 years, 2 precious, difficult, still hopeful years, in which to try to address the accumulated problems of the colony. He worked with his assembly on a new constitutional document, the Charter of Privileges of 1701, which gave the assembly even greater powers of self-government. This charter was, in many ways, the most genuinely democratic document that Penn produced, a step further toward the ideal of popular self-governance that had been his goal from the beginning. He also tried to address the financial chaos of the colony, the land disputes, the fraying relationships between settlers and Lenape neighbors that were beginning to show the strain of 20 years of colonial expansion. And then, in 1701, he was forced to return to England again. The threat of the colonial administration being reorganized by Parliament, which would have meant the end of Pennsylvania's unique system of governance, required his personal presence in London. He never came back. In 1712, Penn suffered a series of strokes that left him mentally incapacitated. He could not recognize people he had known for decades. He could not sign his own name. He lived for 6 more years in this condition, cared for by his wife Hannah with steadfast devotion, dying at last in 1718 at the age of 73. Hannah Penn ran the colony for the next 8 years, managing the legal and financial tangles with formidable competence, fending off challenges from multiple directions, and holding the proprietary system together long enough for Penn's sons to inherit it. But the sons who inherited Pennsylvania were not their father. John Penn, Richard Penn, and Thomas Penn, the sons of Penn's second marriage to Hannah Calloville, were men of their time rather than visionaries ahead of their time. They were concerned with the financial return from the colony, with the management of their property, with the social respectability and political security of the Penn family. Thomas Penn, who eventually took control of Pennsylvania's affairs, was a calculating, efficient man who shared almost none of his father's spiritual convictions. He converted to Anglicanism. He was determined to extract the maximum financial return from the colony. And he was prepared to deal with the Lenape in ways that his father would not have sanctioned. In 1737, Thomas Penn and his agents produced a document purporting to record a treaty made by William Penn with the Lenape in the early years of the colony. The treaty, as they described it, had granted the English settlers as much land as a man could walk in a day and a half from a particular starting point on the Delaware River. Whether such an agreement was actually made, and if so, in what exact terms, is disputed by historians. But what happened next is not disputed. Thomas Penn hired the fastest runners in the colony, cleared a path through the forest, and employed men on horseback to carry provisions and water to the runners so they could maintain their pace. In the allotted day and a half, the runners covered not the 25 or 30 miles that the Lenape had understood as a reasonable day's walk, but 64 miles, nearly twice the distance. The boundary was then drawn at a right angle to the runner's path rather than following the river as the Lenape had understood it would, and the result was that the Penn proprietors claimed 1,200 square miles of Lenape land. The Lenape were outraged. Their chiefs protested that they had been cheated, that the agreement had never been understood this way, that the whole thing was fraudulent. The protests were ignored. The land was taken. And the walking purchase of 1737 became one of the most notorious acts of colonial land fraud in American history. The Lenape were driven from the land their ancestors had occupied for thousands of years. Some moved west into the Ohio Valley. Some allied with the French in the wars that were coming. Some simply dispersed, their communities broken by dispossession and disease and the relentless pressure of colonial expansion. Tidiuscan, a Lenape chief of the mid-18th century, would spend years trying to get the walking purchase reversed or compensated. He called it, in his testimony before colonial authorities, a fraud, a word that was true and that no one in power was prepared to act on. The contrast between what William Penn had built and what his heirs had done with it is one of the most melancholy stories in American colonial history. Penn had understood, in some deep and genuine way, that the land could not be settled peacefully without the honest consent of the people who were already there. His sons had learned nothing of this. Or perhaps they had learned it and simply didn't care. The holy experiment had always had this shadow over it, the structural impossibility of building a just society on land that belonged to someone else, no matter how careful and sincere the initial negotiations. Penn's good faith had delayed the reckoning, but it had not been enough to prevent it entirely. And when the good faith was replaced by calculation and fraud, the reckoning came swiftly and completely. The walking purchase poisoned Pennsylvania's relationship with its indigenous neighbors for a generation and contributed to the violence of the French and Indian War, when Lenape warriors who had been dispossessed and betrayed fought alongside the French against the English colonists who had broken faith with them. Philadelphia itself, safe behind its rivers and its growing prosperity, was somewhat insulated from the worst of this violence. But the city knew about it. The refugees who came streaming into Philadelphia from the frontier settlements in the 1750s, carrying their terror and their grief, told the story clearly enough. The Peaceable City had been built on ground that was not entirely at peace. And the consequences of that original contradiction, the gap between Penn's genuine vision and the colonial system he had operated within, would take generations to fully work through. But something of Penn's vision survived. Not perfectly, not without stain, but in recognizable form. The tradition of religious liberty, of legal due process, of civic engagement that Penn had planted in Pennsylvania took root and grew. The colony's constitution, its culture of dissent and debate, its acceptance of religious and cultural diversity, all of these fed into the larger stream of American political thought that would, in the 1770s, produce a revolution and a new kind of nation. The men who gathered in Philadelphia in 1776, and again in 1787, were breathing the air of a city that William Penn had imagined a century before. They were arguing in the streets and taverns and meeting halls of a place that had been designed, from its very first street plan, to be a place where argument was possible, where ideas could circulate freely, where no single authority owned the truth. That was Penn's gift. Imperfect, contested, compromised by his own limitations and the limitations of his time. But real. Part 12, The City That Remained. Philadelphia grew. Through the 18th century, decade by decade, it grew into one of the most important cities in the Atlantic world. By the 1750s, it was the largest city in British North America, larger than Boston, larger than New York, larger than any other colonial settlement. Its wharves along the Delaware were crowded with ships from England, the Caribbean, Africa, and the Mediterranean. Its streets were full of the noise and smell and energy of a major commercial center, the clatter of iron-rimmed wagon wheels on cobblestones, the calls of market vendors, the smell of baking bread and roasting coffee and the salt-tide scent of the river at low water. The city that Thomas Holme had laid out in the 1680s, the generous, rational grid, those wide streets, those 5 open squares, had absorbed the growth without losing its fundamental character. The grid had proved capacious enough to hold whatever the city needed to put in it. New buildings filled the lots that had once been kitchen gardens. New streets were named and paved. The city pushed north and south along the Delaware, filling in the spaces between Holmes' original plan and the actual geography of the river's banks. But the 5 squares remained. The open lungs of the city, holding space against the pressure of commerce and growth, insisting on the original vision, the green country town, the place where light and air were not luxuries but rights. The intellectual life of Philadelphia in the mid-18th century was extraordinary. The city had become a center of Enlightenment thought in the New World, a place where ideas were taken seriously, debated vigorously, published and distributed through a network of printers and booksellers that had no equal in North America. Much of this intellectual energy was rooted in the civic culture that Penn had created. The tradition of the open meeting, of the right to speak and be heard, of the equality of persons before the law and before God, all of these created conditions in which ideas could flourish. Benjamin Franklin arrived in Philadelphia in 1723, a 17-year-old runaway printer from Boston, and found in the city something he had not found anywhere else, a place where who you were mattered less than what you could do and what you could think. He spent the next 6 decades making Philadelphia his laboratory and his home, building his printing empire, founding his library and his philosophical society, his fire company and his hospital, all institutions that expressed the same basic conviction that Penn had carried across the Atlantic 40 years before, that ordinary people, given the tools and the opportunity, could solve their own problems. Franklin never wrote extensively about Penn. The two men were from very different worlds, and Franklin's religious skepticism was far removed from Penn's Quaker conviction. But the city that Penn had built was the soil in which Franklin grew. The civic traditions, the culture of voluntary association, the habit of looking at public problems as things that could be solved by organized, collective effort, all of this was Penn's inheritance, as much as anything else. And then came 1776. The Second Continental Congress met in Philadelphia. The delegates who gathered in the State House on Chestnut Street, now called Independence Hall, came from 13 colonies with 13 different histories, 13 different political cultures, 13 different ideas about what exactly they were doing and why. But they met in Penn City. In a building whose brick was the same warm red as the houses Penn's first settlers had built. In streets that still followed Holmes' grid, still opened into the green squares that Penn had insisted upon. They debated, argued, compromised, and ultimately signed their names to a document that began with words that had been implicit in Penn's founding vision a century before, that all men were created equal, that they were endowed with unalienable rights, that among these rights were life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The language of the Declaration of Independence is Thomas Jefferson's. His genius with words was unmatched. But the ideas in that document had been circulating in Philadelphia for decades, nurtured by the civic culture and legal traditions that Penn had established. The right to liberty of conscience, the presumption of innocence, the idea that government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed, these were not new ideas in Philadelphia in 1776. They were the inherited common sense of a city that had been practicing them, imperfectly but persistently, for nearly a century. And then, 11 years later, the Constitutional Convention met in the same building. The founders who gathered in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787, sweating through one of the hottest summers in memory in their wool coats and tight cravats, were working out the details of a system of government that would govern a nation of 4 million people stretching from New England to Georgia. The compromises they reached in that room, including the terrible compromise on slavery that would take a civil war to finally resolve, were the work of many hands and many minds. But the city in which they worked had shaped them, subtly and pervasively, in ways they may not have fully recognized. The tradition of negotiation rather than domination. The idea that authority must justify itself through reason and consent rather than through force or tradition. The habit of assuming that people of different backgrounds and beliefs can, with sufficient goodwill and careful structure, find a way to live and work together. These were Philadelphia habits. William Penn habits. Holy experiment habits. The Constitution that emerged from those deliberations was not perfect. Its framers knew it was not perfect. They built into it mechanisms for amendment, for revision, for the kind of ongoing negotiation and adjustment that Penn himself had always understood was necessary. Let men be good, Penn had written in the preface to his frame of government, and the government cannot be bad. It was a high standard. Maybe an impossibly high standard. But it was also an aspiration, a direction, and in the best moments of American history, it has served as a compass pointing towards something better. Penn's grave is in Jordan's, Buckinghamshire, England. A simple stone in a quiet Quaker burial ground, surrounded by the graves of other friends, under the shade of old trees. No elaborate monument, no heroic sculpture, nothing that would violate the testimony of simplicity that he had lived by. Just a name, and dates, and the particular quality of stillness that old Quaker graveyards have, a silence that is neither empty nor lonely, but full, somehow, of the accumulated presence of all the people who have sat quietly in that place, waiting for the light. The city he built is still there. Philadelphia today is a city of 1.5 million people, with all the complexity and contradiction and beauty and difficulty that a major American city carries. It has been, over the centuries, a city of tremendous creative energy and tremendous injustice, of extraordinary intellectual achievement and grinding poverty, of political corruption and political reform, of art and crime and commerce and devotion. The 5 squares are still there. Logan Square, with its fountain and its great cathedral and its science museum. Rittenhouse Square, the most beloved of the 5, where in good weather the benches are full and children run on the grass and old men play chess and the tulip trees bloom in April with a reckless, extravagant beauty. Washington Square, quieter, shadowed by old trees, with its memorial to the unknown soldiers of the Revolution who were buried there in unmarked graves. Franklin Square, recently restored, full of miniature golf and a fountain that catches the light. And Penn Square, which is really Center Square now, buried under the weight of City Hall, that enormous, ornate, overreaching Victorian building that sits where Penn's original Central Square was planned. Above the tower of City Hall, 348 feet above the street, stands a bronze statue of William Penn. He faces northeast, toward the Delaware River, toward the land he crossed the Atlantic to find. His hat is on his head. It never comes off. For almost a century, by a gentleman's agreement among Philadelphia's builders and planners, no building in the city was constructed taller than the brim of Penn's hat. The agreement was finally broken in 1984, when the Liberty One skyscraper rose above the old limit. And the Philadelphia Phillies famously lost the World Series for the next 25 years, blamed by the superstitious on the breaking of the Penn Pact. Whether the curse was real is a matter of great seriousness among a certain portion of Philadelphia's population. But the story itself, the idea that the city's fortunes were somehow tied to the figure standing above it, half-fixed, gaze turned toward the river, says something true about how Philadelphia understands itself. This is Penn's city. It was built on his dream. And the dream, for all its imperfections and contradictions and the long shadow of its failures, was real. It was a dream about what cities are for. About what they can be. About the possibility, stubbornly, persistently present in human history despite all the evidence against it, that people can live together in peace if you give them enough room, enough freedom, and enough reason to trust each other. Penn gave Philadelphia its room. In those generous, wide streets, those 5 breathing squares, that grid designed to hold whatever the future might require. He gave it its freedom. In those laws that said, your conscience is your own. Your faith is your own. The state will not reach into the most intimate place of your inner life and demand compliance. And he tried, imperfectly, within the constraints of his time and his own limitations, to give it a reason to trust. In those early treaties with the Lenape, made under the elm at Chacamaxon. In those letters to diverse communities across Europe, saying, "Come, there is room here for you." In that frame of government that said, however haltingly, the people who live here have a say in how they are governed. The Peaceable City. The Holy Experiment. The green country town that would never be burnt and always be wholesome. 340 years after the Welcome dropped anchor in the Delaware, the experiment continues. It has not concluded. It never quite concludes. That is both its fragility and its extraordinary, stubborn, inextinguishable strength. Closing meditation. Let the story settle now. Let the streets of Philadelphia grow quiet in your mind, the warm brick and the wide pavements, the 5 green squares breathing gently in the night air, the Delaware River still moving in the dark beyond the city's edge. Think of William Penn, just for a moment, not the bronze statue above the city, not the historical figure in the painting, but the man. The young man standing in the courtroom, refusing to remove his hat. The prisoner writing by candlelight in a cold cell, trying to put his conviction into words. The traveler at the ship's rail, watching England disappear behind him, carrying a dream that he was not entirely sure was possible. The man kneeling on American soil, picking up a handful of earth, holding it in his hands. We carry our dreams across long distances. Across oceans, across decades, across the gap between what we imagine and what we can actually build with our imperfect, tired, well-intentioned human hands. Most of what we build falls short of what we dreamed. Penn City fell short of his vision. And yet the vision shaped the city, and the city shaped a nation, and the nation, for all its own falling short, carries within it the memory of what someone once believed was possible. That is not nothing. That is, in fact, everything. Let your breath slow now. Feel the weight of your body, easy and still. The river is quiet. The streets are quiet. The 5 squares hold their green silence under the stars. William Penn is resting in his quiet grave in Buckinghamshire, under old trees, in the company of friends. The city he built is sleeping, its lights reflected in the dark water of the Delaware. And you are safe, and warm, and held. Let sleep come now, as easily and gently as the tide. The experiment continues. And tonight, at least, it is at peace. Rest now. Rest now. If you're still awake, that's okay. Just close your eyes and let the story carry you. Subscribe to History for Sleep for a new story every week. Sweet dreams.